When I got into cubing around 15 years ago, there was a cool new puzzle around called the Golden Cube. Designed by Tony Fisher and later mass-produced by Mefferts in 2008, it was kind of like the Skewb version of a ghost cube, which I'll explain a little bit more later. But this review of it in particular is one of my strongest childhood memories of watching cubing videos. I actually remember exactly where I was rewatching it years later on the very night that I decided to make this channel. So it's a big shame that shortly after this awesome puzzle was released, it went out of stock and you haven't been able to buy one new ever since. They do often pop up used on eBay, sometimes even custom made versions by Tony Fisher himself, but these often go for hundreds of dollars, which just seems a little bit more than I can justify spending on some nostalgia. But then all these years later, after getting into designing and 3D printing my own twisty puzzles from scratch, I realized that if I want to experience the Golden Cube in the year 2025, I can just make my own at home. But before I dive in headfirst on 3D modeling this legendary puzzle, I realized that a good first step would be to try and make my own Skewb. The Golden Cube, of course, is essentially a shape mod of a Skewb. So basically you rotate it to a random angle like this and then cut down all the sides again to turn it back into a cube. That means it's gonna look exactly like one of these on the inside, which means I better know how to design one ahead of time. And surprisingly, it's not all that much different than designing a 3x3, which I went into a lot more detail on in my recent video about 3D printing some speed cubes. But essentially what it comes down to is first drawing a simple cross section. That's essentially the shape that divides all the pieces while still allowing them to lock underneath each other. So if you look at the line where this edge meets the piece next to it, you can see that it comes down in a straight line, it goes across in a short little curve, it goes down like this, back into the middle, down, and then back out again. And essentially all you have to do in the 3D modeling software is to draw that line inside of a cube and use it to make the cut between these two layers. You can do the same thing between these two layers and then repeat on the other two axes. So you make this cut and this cut, and then this cut and this cut. And then bam, out come the pieces of a functional Rubik's Cube, and all you really had to do was draw that one cross section. So when you're making a Skewb, the biggest difference is just where those axes are. So instead of having 1, 2, 3 axes and making 2 cuts down each one, we now have 4 different axes, and they go kind of diagonally between the corners like this. So you have 1, 2, 3, and then 4. And now you can see we're only making 1 cut down each axis, right down the middle. Now, of course, the cross section that you're using to cut down that line is going to look a little bit different than on a 3x3. There's actually a bunch of different ways to do this for a Skewb, but I'm going to take some inspiration from my favorite, the GAN. You can see just looking head on at an edge piece like this, that it goes down for a little bit, sticks out briefly, and then goes way back in, down a little bit, back out, and then back down. So in my 3D modeling software, I went ahead and drew a very similar line inside of a cube. The hardest part was just making sure you're drawing it in the right place. Getting all the 3-dimensional angles right is really tricky on a Skewb. And after that, all I had to do was make a few refinements like rounding off all the sharp corners, splitting the centers into 2 different pieces, a lower center piece and an upper center cap, making a hole in them to fit a screw and spring, making a core for that screw to fit into. And just for good measure, I also added some perfectly sized holes in between each center and edge to fit some magnets into. Here's what the resulting pieces looked like. Pretty darn good for a first attempt if you ask me. So then I exported those pieces and 3D printed them all out, removed all the support material and cleaned everything up with a knife, assembled the core, put in all the magnets, and put everything together. And here's the result. My very first attempt at a 3D printed Skewb, and what can I say? It sure looks like a Skewb. And let me just tell you, the turning on this thing is low-key kind of awesome. I guess that shouldn't be too much of a surprise since it's based on the mechanism of a GAN Skewb. I definitely could have rounded off the corners a lot more because it still is a little bit catchy, but overall, the turning is just so smooth and fluid. It's funny comparing to my very first Skewb, which I actually competed with over 10 years ago. This thing is just absolute nonsense. This one is 10,000 times better, and I made it in an afternoon. Of course, I didn't bother putting any stickers on it because I was feeling lazy and don't actually need another Skewb right now, but it was a very good proof of concept, and now we have the whole mechanism that we need to make a Golden Cube. All we really have to change now is how our base cube is oriented in space. So instead of cutting it down all these nice, neat, symmetrical lines, we're still gonna make all the same cuts, but now our cube is gonna be rotated at some weird angle and our axes are gonna make no sense. But as I was initially playing around with rotating that cube in space, I stumbled across something kind of cool. If you literally just do one 45-degree rotation and then do all the same cuts as a Skewb, you end up with this cool looking puzzle, which would be commonly called a Fisher Skewb. Of course, that's named after the Fisher Cube, which is just a 3x3 that's rotated 45 degrees, which funny enough was invented by the same guy who created the Golden Cube, Tony Fisher. The Fisher Skewb, on the other hand, was apparently first made by Nathan Wilson, and Moyu actually mass-produced a version of it years ago. Let's just say I got a little bit distracted with trying to make my own cool version of a Fisher Skewb. You may notice that the two square sides look a little bit awkward. It's kind of like one big square surrounded by a bunch of little squares and skinny rectangles. My thought was, what if I simplify that by stretching the whole puzzle out, making it into more of a rectangular prism, so that the two square sides on the end were literally just made up of one piece each. And so here's what I ultimately came up with, and I decided this thing looks so much cooler and cleaner than the original Fisher Skewb that I just had to try it. So I did all the same design work as on the Skewb, but this time I also added in some colored tiles so that you'd actually be able to solve it. I then 3D printed all those pieces out, taking advantage of the multicolor feature of my printer, and once again cleaned all the pieces up, assembled the core, the magnets, put the tiles on, put everything together, and this was what I ended up with. I think this thing looks so cool, just the nice clean X pattern on all the sides, plus just the blank square on top and bottom. I made the square just a little bit smaller than a standard size cube to compensate for it being so much longer on this axis, and so it actually feels pretty reasonably sized in your hands. And sure enough, this thing turns exactly like a Skewb, but rotated 45 degrees. So let's do a sledgehammer. 1, 2, 3, 4. Of course, this thing is going to shapeshift like mad, especially for such a simple looking puzzle. Like, just look at those two squares next to each other. That is ridiculous. Will this be more or less difficult than a normal Fisher Skewb? I have no idea. I think it'll at least be pretty similar, so let's try it out. So I think we want to start by getting one centerpiece in the four corners around it. So here's a nice blue one in place. The next one here should be red. That red one is obviously not oriented correctly, but I think we can take it out and maybe spin it around. There we go. Next we have another red one, which is a little bit bizarre. That is just a very weird looking scenario, but I guess we need to replace this one with green. There's a green one right here. I think we have to rotate it like that. There we go. Now we have two blue ones next to each other. I guess that needs to be orange. This orange one cannot physically move into that slot. It's just not the right type of piece, but this one can. And there we go. Here is our first layer. So if we were following the beginner's method, we would look at these top corners and see what shape they're in. So you can kind of imagine there being headlights right here and two yellow pieces sticking out. So I guess that means we have to do a sledgehammer like this. And that means that all of these will now be facing up. And now we just have to get yellow onto the top by doing a U-perm over here. So sledge right here, turn around very carefully, sledge right here, and now there we go, yellow on top. So all of our corners are now solved, and we now just have these three centerpieces that are incorrect. This one is obviously the opposite one, which I think means we can just do a U-perm starting right here, and that should solve it. So one sledgehammer over here, I think another sledgehammer right there, and oh no, we have some sort of parody where the centers are flipped around. That obviously can't normally happen on a Skewb, but here's a cool trick. If you want to just twist around two centerpieces on a Skewb, all you have to do is hold them on the top and on the back, do a U-perm from the front. So sledgehammer, and then sledgehammer on the back. And then you just have to undo that U-perm. So one more time, sledgehammer, sledgehammer on the back. And there we go. That'll twist those two, top and back. And on a puzzle like this, if you want to twist just one centerpiece around, let's say this one, you would just hold it in the back like this with white on top, which you obviously don't care how it's rotated, and then start your U-perms from here instead. So that was a fun little detour with the Fisher Skewb Prism. I don't know, I bet you guys can come up with a much better name down in the comments. But now it's time to get to the main act, the Golden Cube. I thought this was going to be an absolute nightmare to 3D model and get all the angles right, but it turned out to actually not be that bad. So now, instead of taking our Skewb model and just rotating it 45 degrees, we have to figure out the exact angle in space that it has to be. But luckily, one of these corner pieces ends up being cut perfectly flat in the final puzzle, so it's just a perfectly symmetrical triangle. So what I did was just line up one of the corners to be right in the middle of one of the faces of the final cube, and that gave me a very good starting point. Now, the tricky thing is, the Golden Cube isn't a perfect shape mod of a fully aligned Skewb, the way that the Fisher Skewb is. Instead, you essentially do a partial turn on the Skewb before doing all your crazy cuts to turn it back into a cube. This is exactly the idea behind a ghost cube, where the cubic state is a little bit misaligned, and you actually have to mess up the cube a little bit like this to line up the pieces of the 3x3 to allow it to turn on all the axes. And so basically, once I got one half of the cube looking correct based off that nice symmetrical corner, I literally just started turning the Skewb inside my 3D modeling software and making cuts in different locations until I could tell that the resulting puzzle looked exactly like a Golden Cube. I don't know if I got the angle exactly right, but it was pretty dang close, and here's what the result resulting pieces look like. Of course, I went through and did all the normal rounding and center caps and adding holes for magnets. It was a lot more work to model than most puzzles because every single piece is unique, so you can't just be lazy and make a bunch of copies of one of them. But the upside is, that means this puzzle doesn't need any colored stickers, which meant I could be a little bit more lazy in that aspect. Of course, I did want to be true to the name, so I bought myself some golden filament to print it out of, which should make it look really nice, or at least a lot nicer than black or something. So one final time, I went ahead and loaded all the pieces up and sent them through the 3D printer. I cleaned up all the pieces. The knife was getting a little bit dull at this point, so I ended up cutting my fingers a little bit too. Oops. Assembled everything together, and so here it is, the golden cube, finally in my hands. I will say the gold filament does look a little bit weird if you just hold it in one place because it's kind of shiny and the light reflects off it differently depending on how it was printed. But if you move it around like this, just all the light just shining in different directions looks amazing. I will say that I decided to make this thing the same size as a normal Skewb just to make it easy to hold in your hands. But the original golden cube was actually significantly bigger because it was literally made by taking a Skewb and extending the pieces outward. But I'm totally happy making that one little concession for convenience. Now you can see up here, this is the one perfectly symmetric triangle that I was talking about. Every single other piece is a little bit wacky, a little bit asymmetrical looking. Interestingly, these two pieces and these two pieces are actually the same shapes, which makes for kind of a cool looking pattern on this face. But because of the way a Skewb works, these are actually different types of pieces, so they can't be interchanged. Another fun little curiosity is that I had to add an extra set of magnets to get it to snap into place, not only when it's aligned, but also when it's cubic like this, which is technically misaligned. Whereas that actually wouldn't have been necessary on the original, because old Skewbs actually use ball bearings to snap into place, which annoyingly click not just when they're aligned, but also when they're slightly misaligned like this. So you get kind of 3 clicks per turn, and they use that to their advantage to get that extra click when it's lined up as a cube. But without further ado, let's finally start doing some turns and scrambling this thing up. I have been wanting to do this for literally like 2/3 of my life. I don't think I've ever touched one of these in person. This thing just gets so jumbled up so quickly. I have no idea how difficult it'll be to solve. I imagine having a good knowledge of what the pieces look like and how they fit together will be pretty helpful here. So I think that's probably scrambled enough. I'm gonna start with this nice equilateral triangle because I know it goes next to this nice symmetric looking centerpiece right here. There we go. And it looks like the opposite one is also lined up. So we just gotta find the two that go opposite right here. Okay, I think I found one of the other corners right here. So let's put that in like this. There we go. So we've got 3 out of the 4. The other one, I don't think we're going to be able to find because of the ghost thing. Or maybe we can just find one that lines up when we do a partial turn. Let me see. Okay, so this corner piece right here is just a partial turn away from being solved. So I guess we can use that one. I don't know. I'm trying to solve it like a Skewb, but I'm not sure if that's even the best method here. So I guess we want to solve these 4 corners next. Only one of them is going to be really obvious when it's solved based on our point of reference over here. So I know it needs to be rotated this way. So I guess let's just kind of guess and do a sledgehammer over here to see if that lines things up. Okay, I messed things up a little bit there, but then I got a little bit lucky and it looks like we now have all of our corner pieces in place. So on this side and then even the 3 on this side, if you misalign them a little bit, you can see they're all lined up with the cube. So next up, we want to insert our top center, which it looks like is actually the one that's already in there. It's just flipped around 180 degrees. So let's do our little trick from earlier to flip that around with a couple U-perms. All right, somehow I didn't think that was gonna work. It's so hard sometimes to figure out what axis you're on this thing, but it looks like it did work and we now have our top center in place, which means it's now just these 4 centers around the edge. Okay, so I just stared at this for a solid minute and it looks like this centerpiece is in the right place but flipped, so let's ignore that one for now, and that means the remaining 3 are gonna be a U-perm, and it looks like this one needs to go to the back right here. I think that's the right piece at least, which means we're gonna have, if we align this, a U-perm starting right here. So let's go ahead and very carefully execute this. So what followed that last confidence statement was spectacularly messing up that U-perm, starting again from scratch, messing that up again, eventually realizing that this stupid symmetric triangle creates this horrific parody where all the last layer corners are oriented the wrong way. Dealing with that over and over again while constantly messing up my sledgehammers, and then like 15 minutes later, I finally got back to where I was before, did a very careful U-perm, and now we finally have all the pieces in the right spot. We just have these 2 center pieces that are rotated by 180 degrees. So let's go ahead and put them next to each other and then very carefully do our double U-perm to go ahead and rotate those back into place. All right, I can feel it coming into place. Last couple of moves here and oh, there we go. The golden cube is finally solved. Oh my gosh, that was 10 times harder than I expected it to be. I guess that makes sense though. It was literally all the frustrations of a normal ghost cube combined with the weird movement of a Skewb. I bet there's probably a better way to solve this thing, probably doing like 1/2 at a time rather than just doing Sarah's beginner Skewb method like what I was doing. But man, I'm just happy that I finally figured it out on my own. And I will say that after 15 years from first seeing a video about this thing absolutely lived up to the hype. So much fun to solve. So I guess childhood dream finally accomplished, learned some cool 3D modeling and printing skills along the way, and even made a cool puzzle of our own that I think is fairly original. Now I know everyone's been asking for download links for the 3D models of the things that I make in my videos, so I'm gonna start doing that right now. Out of respect for Tony Fisher, I'm not gonna be providing downloads for the Golden Cube. If you want one of those, I guess you're either gonna have to pay up on eBay or put in the effort to learn how to make one yourself. But I think the other two are fair game, so check out the description down below to figure out how to download those, a few versions of the 3x3 speed cubes that I made in a previous video, and even the little connector pieces between these big 3x3s if you want to make one of these of your own. I am going to keep these really simple with none of the added tile pieces on top because I figure most people don't have fancy multicolor printers. And for obvious reasons, that doesn't include the nifty Z3 cubing logo mod, 7 puzzles in one, and of course all the coasters and keychains that you can buy from z3cubing.com. Heck, there's even nice comfy t-shirts. You can't 3D print those either. Anyway, that's pretty much it. I really hope you all enjoyed this super fun 3D printing project as much as I did, but I'll see you guys next time.